So, looking ahead to November and the presidential election, the expectation is that there'll be a surge in mail in ballots. But what that means is that we may not actually get the results the way we used to, or as quickly as we used to. It could take days to find out the end of the results, turning election day into really what might be election week. There is data suggesting that Democrats might vote by mail more than Republicans, raising the prospect that President Trump will be ahead on election night, only to later lose as absentee ballots or mail-in ballots favor the presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. This unprecedented situation brought on by the coronavirus pandemic spurred the UC Irvine School of Law to create an ad hoc committee for the 2020 election fairness and legitimacy.
The report, titled Fair Elections During a Crisis, made a series of urgent recommendations in law, politics, tech, and the media on how to ensure public confidence in this election. So joining us now is one of the members of that committee. Jack Doppelt is a professor of journalism at Medill at Northwestern University, and he's going to break this down for us. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks a lot. Good to be talking with you.
All right, so let's break this down. The report you've contributed to makes a series of election night coverage recommendations to the news media, and a big one is prepare to report that the race is too early to call. I mean, I got to ask you why you think that it's so important, but I get why that's important, but explain the data and the research behind that.
Yeah, I don't think it's that critical in terms of the words to say too early to call rather than too close to call. But the idea behind it is that because there are going to be a huge percentage of mail-in ballots in every state, or almost every state, especially the swing states, which all have mail-in ballots as part of the way they do their elections, that we're not really going to know the actual numbers till at least a week later.
So one of the other recommendations that you have is to debunk misinformation, that we're going to have to actively debunk misinformation. We've already seen the president, send out tweets that are not accurate about mail-in ballots. And so we know it's coming because it's already here. Here's my question to you. Debunking misinformation is really hard. We just had a whole conversation with a doctor about misinformation about wearing masks, whether the actual wearing of the mask is what's making you sick. And at times, and Vlad, I'll speak for you too, we sort of feel like we're screaming into an empty room because people tend to listen to the information that they want to believe. So how effective do you think the media's attempts, or if the media sort of goes by your guidelines and tries to debunk information, how effective do you think that'll be?
Well, great question. And our recommendation really had to do with how the media should go about it. And so one thing is to put, before you end up in a story, before you say what you know is a misinformation, put in what's accurate, because studies show that people will take a look at what's first and assume that's the accurate part, and then you can begin debunking, rather than, let's say, giving the misinformation priority. So I don't mean to pick here, but in your introduction, for instance, you said that historically, Democrats get more votes in mail-in ballots than Republicans. That's not accurate. And that perpetuates, and it's one of those pieces that we've got in our bloodstream now that perpetuates what people who are against mail-in ballots, let's say Trump and the Republican Party, just to be short about it, are going to make that argument, and it's going to support their argument. It's just not true.
So, Professor, one of the things that people that I've spoken to are worried about is a repeat of Bush v. Gore, in that an election can appear to go one way, and the evidence may even point to that conclusion, but either the judiciary or other, whether it's a partisan news outlet, sort of balances or puts their finger on the scale, and that results in a decision that is perhaps not accurate. And so, as Anne-Marie points out, I mean, part of the problem that has happened over the last couple of years is that there have been partisan cable news networks, for example, that have sought to sow this disinformation, this misinformation. And there's not a lot that you can do about it because, as Anne-Marie says, people want their beliefs parroted back to them. And it's clear that many people are not interested in facts, are not interested in the truth. How else can you understand why people refuse to wear masks in the midst of a global pandemic? So how then to combat that?
Great question. In the voting area, in the electoral area, the best example is how many states have put into law legislation to combat vote fraud when there is almost no evidence whatsoever that most of these techniques, voter IDs, opposing absentee ballots, that there is vote fraud to need to have opposition to those things. And so we have a notion that the Republican Party and legislators have already bought into, that there is vote fraud that needs to be combated in multiple ways. And so a perfect example, ideal example, is Iowa's primary a week ago. Iowa had a primary in which the Secretary of State, who happens to be a Republican, sent out absentee ballots to all eligible voters. The result of that in the primary was the highest turnout ever, no evidence whatsoever of vote fraud. And since that time, and we're talking now really under 3 weeks, the Republican legislature, both houses being Republican and the governor being Republican, enacted a law that forces the Secretary of State to wait until people apply for a absentee ballot before they send it out. And that's a huge difference because there are all kinds of reasons why people don't send in those applications, why there may be things on the application that, you don't cross your T, dot your I, and the Secretary of State might not send out the absentee ballot after a request. And so that's a key. It's a perfect example of how the notion of vote fraud made up is just undermining the ability to have more people vote in a reasonable way. Compounded, of course, by the pandemic and the need to have absentee ballots so that people aren't standing in long lines like what happened in Georgia, and they're always in minority or poorer communities, or what happened in Wisconsin. So all of this stuff is kind of feeding into itself, and it's really hard, especially if the partisan news organizations are putting out propaganda rather than news, how to combat that.
It is indeed a significant problem, Professor, and compounded with the things that you mentioned is the President of the United States himself suggesting that American elections are rigged, especially when they don't go the way that he wants them to go, which is the kind of language I only heard when I was based in Africa covering fledgling democracies there. Jack Doppelt, thank you so much for this really illuminating conversation. We really appreciate it.
Sure, you're welcome. Anytime.